Well, what's going on, guys? So in my last devlog, I went over my 8-year 3D modeling and texture painting progress. Since then, I've been working on creating my first game-ready NPC for my game. In order to achieve this, I set 3 major goals. Number 1, gather and use proper reference images for all X, Y, and Z axes. Number 2, model the character and clothing completely with proper topology. And number 3, texture paint the character and clothing in the stylized art style that I envisioned for my game. So I started off by using TuneArt app to get some cartoon-like references I can go off of when modeling. This worked well for the front view, however for the top and side view, I needed proper topology and body proportions, so I checked out other models on the Sketchfab, and these gave me good references as well as a better understanding of how the edge flow should work throughout the entire model. Once I had the reference images set in Blender, I began the modeling process. I started with standard loops around the eyes to form the starting mask, then worked in the loops from the upper nose bridge to the chin. These are important when animating facial expressions so the mesh can deform properly. Next, I worked on getting the nose shape correct, making use of Blender's Annotate tool to draw the nose shape for a guided reference. This helped me a ton throughout the process, especially with the head shape and cheek lines. Next, I attempted to make eye sockets and eyelids, and this is a major area I've struggled with in the past as the socket goes much deeper in the head than I originally thought. I did this to the best of my ability before moving on to the lips, eyebrows, and eventually completing the overall basic face shape. Day 3, I worked on the ear loops and the side of the shape of the head. For the next couple of days, I finished the overall head shape and began refining points with the proportional editing tool to add a bit more detail. This included a bit more fullness in the cheeks and the mouth area, then I decided to add the mustache. Once I was happy with the front view, I went back to refining points in the top and side views. The top of the head should be less rounded and more egg-shaped, while the side view should show more definition in the jawline. So I had to rework some edge flow there to ensure there was a distinct separation from the neck and jawline. Next, I attempted to make the hair, another area of modeling I'm pretty bad at. Started by placing a few spheres around the head and using proportional editing tool to shape them into the size and shape of the reference image. While it wasn't amazing, my first attempt was actually better than I expected. After a bit more refining on the vertices, I felt I could move on to creating the basic body shape. I started by extending the neck down in a block torso and extruded a general arm shape either side. I learned it's most important to get the overall shape to start and then refine it from there. I got the upper body in a decent shape, then worked my way down to make some basic legs. Once I had the overall shape down, I brought in a body reference image to further refine the torso, arms, and leg shape, along with topology for the chest. I then brought in specific references for the hands and feet. I did these separately before attaching them to the model. From here, I was pretty happy with how the model was looking, so I began working on the clothing. I planned this character to have a button-down shirt, khakis, and brown dress shoes. Starting with the shoes, I modeled the bottom rubber sole, then worked my way up, modeling the leather part of the shoe. Finally, I added some basic fit laces and sized/positioned them to fit the character's feet. Working my way up, I duplicated the character's legs, then separated the mesh into separate pants object. I increased the size and adjusted the vertices to make it look like looser clothing. Next, I moved on to making the shirt. Just as I did with the pants, I made a copy of the character's torso and used that as a base mesh for the shirt. After I refined the basic shirt shape, I added some thicker cuffs and a neckline. The collar was trickiest part as I had to extrude it up from the neckline, scale it outwards, then down again. I settled for a basic collar with a plan to further refine it later on. It was at this point I was pretty happy with the model's appearance, so I began the texture painting process. Adding materials for the skin, hair, and clothing, I set out to make the stylized eyes as my first real texture painting task. I had Pixar-type eyes on my other screen as a reference while I worked in GIMP to create something similar. This was interesting because the pupils are generally much larger in these cartoon-type eyes, and light reflections/highlights are usually faked by being painted on between the pupil and the iris. In addition, there's a dark outer border on the iris, as a dark shadow between that border and the iris. So I started with basic colors, then used the Dodge Burn tool in GIMP to darken the outer ring. In addition, the outer eye is not completely white, but rather a slight gray above the lower eyelid and below the upper eyelid. Without this, you get bug eyes staring into your soul. So after experimenting with this for a while, I ended up texture painting a pretty decent eye with unique iris lines, shadows in the proper spots, along with a light reflection between the iris and pupil. I continued adding shadows to the other areas of the face, such as behind the eyebrows, under the hairline, and around/under the nose. With each minor addition of highlights and shadows, I felt the character getting closer and closer to the art style that I envisioned. Once I was happy with the face, I shifted texture painting to the shoes, shirt, and hair. My workflow was pretty similar throughout this process. I texture painted the shoes to the best of my ability, knowing I wanted black rubber soles and a brown shoe. Then I checked out images of other brown dress shoes to see what else could be added or tweaked. Some examples included a darker brown around the shoe opening, shadows above the sole, and a light highlight on the rounded front part of the shoe to simulate light reflecting off of it. For the shirt, I redid the collar, then added a darker blue for the cuffs and for the shadows of the collar. I painted in some buttons and seams around the arms in the middle of the shirt. And finally, I added a front pocket with some darker shadows to attempt to make it look more 3D. I attempted the same process for the hair, trying to add highlights and shadows to make it look better than just one plain brown or dark brown color. Considering I had no skill in texture painting hair, it came out pretty good, in my opinion. I've learned though that it's better to create bigger shapes of varying colors rather than draw in small strands of hair, especially for stylized type characters. So over the next few weeks I did some research on hand painting stylized characters. Some improvements included using warmer pink or reddish colors around the cheeks, nose, and eyes, while using cooler blue or grayish colors on the sides of the face or under the hairline to portray bone structure, shadows, and separate portions of the face. In the final days before making this video, I went back to my color theory lessons to add more saturation and contrast to further improve the model. This included subtle shadows below the collar, where the neck meets the shirt opening, also shadows in the inseams of pants, under the brow line, and under the chin and the neck area. In addition, I learned to add more saturation to the skin and darken the hair to provide more contrast for the character. For stylized characters, the order of visual importance should be eyes, face, then clothing. In addition, every character will need to have a unique silhouette, and that you can tell which character it is just from their shadow. Some examples include Goku, Super Mario, and Pikachu. So it's been 8 years, but I'm proud to say I finally have the necessary skills now and knowledge to create the rest of my characters for my game in this same stylized quality. At this point, I'll be working on making the remaining characters for my game, and I'm excited to see how they will look when finished. Thanks as always for watching, and stay tuned for the next completed characters in future devlogs.